All righty, welcome everybody. I'm James Felton Keith. This is a briefing on the new international ISO 30415 standard for diversity and inclusion. I am going to, I see a few people still logging in. I'm just going to share screen and get right to it in hopes that we can maximize our time. This should only be say a 15, 20-minute presentation, and then we can do some Q&A. This is just a little bit about me. I've done a bunch of things. I was recently in Marseille with the Foreign Direct Investment Office, where we met the Consulate General and a few other people. As our company, Inclusion Score, works directly with firms like AFNOR and the French government to push out certification and education on this new ISO standard. For the Americans on the line, I'm assuming you all are all Americans. We also administer a large National Science Foundation grant from the current presidential administration across most of the large engineering societies in the US. Obviously, they have a lot of international reach. Again, we administer this grant along with a bunch of universities here in the country to, again, just educate folks about this standard and its use. So I'll go into presentation mode. I may switch to a browser to kind of share what we're doing here. So some of the key topics that I'm going to go over briefly is what are standards for anyone not familiar with international standards, or ISO standards as we call them. Why are they important? What is ISO 30415? And again, how can you all leverage it as diplomats, et cetera? So this is normally a presentation that we give to folks for a certificate of participation, but we don't have to worry about all that hoopla here. Anyway, if anyone's not familiar, I don't know if you all have the ability to do show of hands, but if you're not familiar with the ISO, or the International Organization for Standards, I'll move through some of these slides kind of fast. But ever since World War II, I'd say the majority of us have been convening at the International Organization of Standards, or International Standards Org. We call it ISO for short, but depending on what language you're speaking, it could be iOS or a lot of different things. There are about 22,000 standards globally, everything from the textiles in your shirts to the fuel in your vehicles to the water that you drink is built on a standard. And we come together at the ISO to essentially agree on language and nomenclature, of which we might modify over time how we agree on how things go. Over the course of the past 40 years, I would say since the mid-'80s, we've been agreeing on standards around business process. So you may be familiar with things like ISO 9001, ISO 20000. Most of our lives, or at least our technological lives, are guided by process engineers and these standards. So that's the ISO. For about the past 10 years, mainly led by a group of Americans, a guy named Ephanis Henderson out of Seattle, and a bunch of other folks. We initially came together about 12 years ago at the Society for Human Resources Management to convene about a group of 200 people to build out a standard. We were just thinking about an American standard at the time for diversity and inclusion that rapidly boiled over to the ISO. The Brits got involved, the French got involved, the Germans got involved, the South Africans, the Indians, the Brazilians, and 163 countries have ratified ISO 30415 as a framework, a methodology to deliver diversity and inclusion as a business practice, or a business process rather, to organizations of all types. So whether your organization is a government or a corporation or a large NGO, if you've got a lot of people, if you've got more than 100 people at your organization, you likely need to start considering how you deliver people engagement as a business process, just how you would cybersecurity or IT service management or accounting or manufacturing or you name it. That's sort of where this is going, right? So again, there's some graphics on the screen. I'll send you some links as well. Or if you just Google ISO 30415, a lot of this information will come up. So anyway, the ISO standard, again, is globally validated method for deploying best practices and really people engagement. So this is not necessarily a moral standard, but this is the building of core infrastructure at any organization type to understand who the people are that make up the organization and how one might best engage and deploy them to manage the organization. There are a lot of spillover impacts of people who are poorly engaged or even disgruntled at organizations and risks that are tied to those risks, like cybersecurity risks, you name it. The worst kind of person you want managing critical assets is someone who does not like being here. Anyway, these are some of the pretty faces of the folks from across the globe who are the flag bearers of the standard right now. We convene once a year. This will be the first time in person at the Diverse Inclusion Service Management, the ISO 30415 DISM Forum. It'll be hosted in Atlanta, Georgia this year, but we'll have visitors from France who lead the training course at AFNOR. If you're not familiar, I'm unable to pronounce the actual long name of AFNOR, but AFNOR is the government certifying body in France for all of these types of standards. So they act as a partner. And again, I can send you some links on them. So again, this is not really new technology, new science, right? It's a new method, a new standard, but this is old news. If you're not familiar, the framework that you see on your screen right now, ISO 20000, came out about 20 years, and it has been the core regulator for how we, again, produce all business processes right now. Likely how you all run your office at, various consulate generals, whether it's at the country level or the city level or you name it, and how the State Department engages the world is likely, not likely, but it's definitely based on this particular standard. And it just provides a methodological approach to how we segment the functional portions of your operation and how we deploy, in this case, technology. We've ported a lot of that consideration over in this AI-driven age to how we identify and deploy people. And so with that said, the standard model is, I think when a lot of people hear diversity inclusion, they think about human resources, but this particular standard is broken out into 4 large categories. It's a lot more sweeping than human resources. It covers organizational governance. Those are things we do with executives, people who have checkbooks in the company or organization, even if it's a government. Obviously, human resources is there. If you look at this inner circle, those are things that we do with our employees. So these are rules and directives, you name it, that we've cataloged over the course of 40 or so years of having engagements and grievances with organizations of all types. The third is product delivery, whether your product is a service like diplomacy or something more tangible like automobiles or mobile phones or you name it. There's a portion of the standard that touches that. And last but not least is supply chain or procurement or supplier diversity, how an institution sources materials and partners with other organizations. All of these are implicated in this particular standard. And so even when you think about things like ESG, which you may hear a lot about either in your work or in the news, which if you're not familiar stands for environmental, social, and governance priorities, I think it should be structured as SGE with the social part of the people part first. This standard would be how one might audit an organization in the social piece of ESG, when there are other standards for the environmental portion and the governance portion of any organization. But again, as people make up all organizations and they audit the technological processes that we deliver, this standard is becoming increasingly important as individuals want to be engaged, especially in the Western world, in a more robust way. And so The actual innovation, though, of the standard is what it has done is productized, for lack of better words, the 4 types of services or activities that an institution might deliver with regards to diversity and inclusion. And I know it's a little bit different in France than it is in the United States. I think the United States is a bit more of a solid bowl society and a little bit more advanced with regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion. But if you look under the number 4 on the left side of your screen, companies are only doing one of these 4 things. They're either training you about something you don't know, they're collecting data, demographic data, sentiment analysis. Those are good examples of data extraction. Or they're building internal infrastructure like affinity groups or employee resource groups, women's group. At the very least, every organization has or should have that group to understand how that demographic is engaged by the organization. And last but not least is external infrastructure. So engagement of any trade associations, chambers of commerce, marketing campaigns, that's all just external infrastructure. And the fact that the standard has codified these 4 project or service types, it can distribute them across, and this is where it gets interesting, the 27 diversity types. And these 27 diversity types is not to say that there aren't billions of types of different people on the planet, but these 27 types are protected classes legally. So it's not just age and race and gender, it's neurodivergence, it's parents, it's pregnant people, it's you name it. It's a lot of different categories that have opportunities, scaling opportunities for filing grievances and legal redress. And we track that here in the United States via the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, but they share data with a lot of different global bodies. And so anyway, what we're doing via the standard is deploying these 4 project types across one, at the very least, the women's group, or many of these 27 protected classes across the 32 domains of the standard. And the 32 domains are those 4 categories I mentioned earlier, which are different than these 4 project types, kind of extrapolated out into functional parts of your organization. And so, again, it's just more examples of sort of what those look like: training, the data extraction, the internal infrastructure, which affinity groups are a good example of it, external infrastructure, again, things like joining the LGBT Chamber of Commerce or the, Jewish Chamber of Commerce, or all these different things, and engaging minority groups to better spread around economic opportunity and economic activity. Again, and they're spread across these 4 categories, which are governance, HR, product delivery, and your supply chain. Again, just to dig a bit deeper on those 27 protected classes, and these are pretty similar across the Western world, including the BRICS minus China. So even if we look at how the Indian Constitution or the South African Constitution engage these 27 categories, it is very similar to what we see in France, in the United States, and everywhere else. All of these groups have some sort of legal protection. Last but not least is those functional parts of the organization that, again, services get distributed through. Those 4 groups that I talked about, again, they extrapolate out into 32 domains. I won't spend time going through all of these domains, but they cover everything from your organizational leadership, those are your executives, to your management ranks, to the everyday people that work at the institution, to things like how you build employee resource groups, to recruiting, to onboarding, the payments, to performance management, to transition and redeployment, to supplier diversity, to you name it. Other organizational stakeholders, even companies that may affect your institution's bottom line, but are not necessarily suppliers. It really covers a gambit in how organizations operate. And again, this graphic is really just a consolidated view of those 32 domains. So these 32 domains are what they are, not just because they represent functional parts of the organization, right? But they also represent various risk elements. So what's really driving this standardization of pushing, again, our 4 functional things that we do through the 27 types of categorization of people that we engage across the 32 portions of any sizable organization is really around that. They extrapolate out into basically a series of questions. But what's really driving this is the risk management industry. So the insurance industry, which is really where I come from, which is, where I was in Marseille a few months, really about a year ago now, about that week before the Pope came, I was talking about immigrants who are in boats on the coastline and how we need to do a better job as a global community of ingesting those people and putting them to work, is really because of this number. So this is the S&P 500's valuation, and it's based on, I think what you see in gold is intangible assets. About 50 years ago, or in 1975, this global collective, which are really all the companies that we interact with, even if they're tier 2, tier 3 companies, they're working for these 500 to produce the goods we are most familiar with. They claimed at that point that about 17% of their balance sheets were intangible assets. If you're not familiar with this term, it's just code for people. But today, or nearly 5 years ago, these same 500 companies claim that 90% of their balance sheets were people. And it's very difficult from a financial standpoint to understand if those people are engraved with your organization. When we see this number come out again next year, we expect it to be well above 90% of the balance sheet. So these are the assets that we claim for the valuations that you see in the stock market versus hard assets, or what used to be called hard assets, like building and property and things like that. We're also starting to see regulatory guidance being pushed out state by insurance commissioners here in the US, which are starting to recognize the need for audits specific to inclusivity. This is the New York State Department of Financial Services, which, if you're not familiar, this particular department usually pushes out regulations that we see in Europe. About 10 years ago, Europe established a big data rights framework called the General Data Protection Regulation, and New York pushed it out of New York as a cyber reg to really implicate anyone tied to a New York bank for an audit. It didn't matter if you were a manufacturer in Ohio or Taipei. If you were connected to New York Mellon Bank or Citigroup or you name it, you needed to have an audit with regards to cyber because of the sorts of systemic risks that you propose to the market. And we're starting to see the same thing happen with people risk. And that's really being driven by these two numbers. These are the past 2 years of reports from the American Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. We've seen grievances or discrimination charges back in 2022 surge about 20%. And this past year, when they reported, they usually report in March, a 30% spike in discrimination charges. Over the course of the past 20 years, though, we've seen about a 5 to 7% spike every year. This is before the pandemic. And what we think is really happening is, for the past 40 or maybe even 50 years, women have been graduating at a higher rate from college than men. And so my whole life, we've seen the available workforce drastically shift, and it is starting to impact regular operational practices, not just here in the United States, but everywhere else. And as the generations get younger and younger and are more and more familiar with their rights, they're more available to file these types of grievances. And not only that, the regulatory and policing institutions that we've established, like the National Labor Relations Board and the EEOC, are enforcing discrimination, non-discrimination suits around, protected classes that we don't normally talk about, like what you see on the right-hand side of your screen with pregnant workers. I should also say what we're seeing in the Western world, not just here in the United States, but in Western Europe, are non-disparagement clauses in NDAs, or non-disclosure agreements, start to go null and void.
James, I am really sorry to interrupt. We're in the middle of a storm, and apparently our basement is flooding. We just had an announcement over the loudspeaker. I'm going to jump off I'm gonna leave, and if my colleagues want to stay on and continue, I fully support, but I'm gonna go check out the flood situation. So
But
I'm gonna hop off. Sorry about
okay,
that.
it's fine. I'll send the
Okay.
video.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right. Thanks. Bye.
be safe. Yeah.
Thanks. Bye.
Wow. So yeah, so those are going up. The last part of the presentation to tie all this in is the ISO standard is an auditing tool, and we think of a diplomatic tool to communicate to corporations about how they can better absorb the modern workforce and include people in a normal economy. But the insurance industry, both in France and everywhere else, is putting a price on a lack of inclusivity. So this framework model that you've seen, the gray color coded model, is not just gray because I like the color of gray, which may be a bit drab. Each of these different color codes are tied to a different type of insurance or liability. So the top tier in governance is normally tied to what we call directors and officers risk or claims. Those are insurance claims that happen when you have a claim against a director or an officer of the company. Employment practice liability, or EPL, which you see on your bottom right, is usually tied to employment risk. And even in countries like France that are less litigious than the United States, for instance, when I was in Marseille, we looked at a series of government fines to manufacturing facilities that claim that they did not have the capacity to hire disabled people, specifically in the mobility space, people in wheelchairs, et cetera. Even when there's not litigation, there is still a fine of sorts, and that is backed by insurance premium. So it happens in Europe, even though Europe and France in particular is less litigious than what we see here in the United States. For the E&O claims, to give you some color on that, errors and omissions is, for instance, people who, even if they're multinational companies that don't meet, for instance, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that's a claim. It's illegal. Even if on your website, like the Volkswagen site that they might rinse and repeat across Germany, France, and the United States, does not have explanations for the pictures on the site, that is now illegal per the Americans with Disability Act, and it does impact every European supplier that supplies both to Europeans and Americans. Last but not least, our management liability claims, and these are usually fines in large metropolitan areas like Marseille, like Lyon, like Paris, and others, where there are mandates to engage minority suppliers, specifically women-owned suppliers, and think about large construction projects and things like that. There are huge fines for failing to meet certain mandates to spread around the accumulated wealth of economic activity in cities. And so there's a new price for a lack of inclusivity. And the price is the price of your insurance premiums, plus all of the activity and investment that a firm might give to inclusion or deliberate inclusion, right? And so again, the standard just continues to extrapolate out. But again, per ESG, if we think about their correlating standards for the environmental, the social, and the governance portion of ESG and how we look at auditing companies and good governance these days is always a cybersecurity standard, which is a sister standard to the one that we've been talking about today. But again, the biggest cyber risk, or 90% of cyber incidents that happen, are human error, whether it's deliberate or an actual mistake. The biggest cyber risk are people who don't have any skin in the game with the institutions that they work for. And so globally, we see about $10 billion a year in claims per risk of those numbers that I showed you earlier, the 20 and 30% spike in discrimination charges that we see in the West. This is the number that they turn into, that these companies' logos that you see below us end up paying the bill for. And it's a big driver in the standardization of how we engage and deploy people, no matter what type of people they are across any country. Again, because it's similar to what cyber security risk was about 10 years ago, it's becoming an unsustainable risk as newer workers and younger workers expect something different than, I'll just throw myself here in the fire, not any of you, than we expected when we started working. I know I started my work in the auto industry, and I was, again, willing to work through a much different environment than I think what we see in 2024. So that's all I got in general. Are there any questions about the standard, about how it's relevant to you all's work, and that sort of thing, or just any questions at all? Questions about my glasses, or I think they're a bit smudged, and I'm losing my voice, so apologies for that. But let's see, how did I do on time? Yeah, it's only 34 minutes in, and I think we started 4 minutes late. So yeah, anything at all?
I don't have any questions. I just wanted to say thank you. This is totally new to me. I don't know any of this, so I'm kind of digesting it, but thank you for taking the time. And will you be able to share your presentation with us
Yes,
afterwards? Is that possible?
I'll share the slides and the video. And one of the main reasons that we wanted to 30415, that we really wanted to have again this conversation is every standard, when it comes out, it's essentially 2 documents. I'll put this in the chat. There's a standard itself, and then there's the implementation manual. An implementation manual is usually lagging by a few years. We expect that technical standard or that implementation manual to come out this December. And what it will do is allow regulators, both here in the United States, but also like the British Standards Institute up in the UK, or again, AFNOR in France, will start to push this out as a framework with more teeth. And there may be potential penalties, especially for some of the multinational organizations in you all's country. And it's a bit of a game changer for how we think about, at least how the Western world engages employment, especially with all of the new immigration that we're all incurring, whether it be specific to the climate crisis or specific to anything else. And so it is, I think, increasingly important that we are having conversations about how we, gobble people up and push them into the normal economy as we talk about global affairs in general. So we'll definitely be, sending out more emails as that new technical standard becomes realized. But yes, I'll send you all a copy of the presentation and the video. And yeah, that's all we got. We're becoming a more integrated world, and we need to be organized about how we move people around. That's the primary thing that we care about. We feel like people who can't afford to find a job and buy food and clothes and shelter, they tend to be a bit difficult, and we want to get ahead of that if we can. So that's all I got. I'll stop sharing. But yeah, I'll give one more.
Thank you.
Check for, okay, so no more. All right, no questions. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'm gonna send this out, and hopefully the basement at the residence isn't too bad.
And our electricity is going on and off too. So
oh, you're there as well. You're in the building. You're not.
Yeah, we're all here in the building.
Oh my God. Okay.
So we'll cut off here, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
all right.
bye.